There's a moment most men go through, but almost nobody talks about it. It's when you realize that the way she treats you isn't really about you, it's about what you provide. When you're solving problems, paying bills, being strong, everything feels smooth. She's warm, she's present, she's there. But the second you slow down, the energy shifts. She becomes distant, less patient, less interested. And you sit there thinking, what did I do wrong? But deep down, something feels off. Because for the first time, you start questioning something uncomfortable. Was I ever loved or just useful? Because for a lot of men, the relationship only works as long as they're useful. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how this dynamic works and why so many men don't see it until it's too late. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it feels like things are working. Daniel is the kind of man most people would describe as solid. He has his life together, he's reliable, he shows up, he handles things. If something breaks, he fixes it. If something goes wrong, he steps in. If there's pressure, he absorbs it. And in the beginning, that seems to create something good. She appreciates him. She leans on him. There's warmth. There's consistency. There's connection. It feels like respect, maybe even love. And Daniel buys into that idea because everything around him reinforces it. This is what a man is supposed to do, right? Provide, protect, solve. So he keeps going. He becomes more present, more dependable, more invested. Not because he's trying to impress her, but because he believes that's what keeps the relationship strong. And for a while, it works. Or at least it looks like it does. Because the shift doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle, almost invisible. It shows up in small moments. A slightly colder response, a little less patience, a tone that wasn't there before. Nothing dramatic, nothing you can point to and say, this is the problem. Just a change in energy. And at first, Daniel ignores it, because everything else still looks fine on the surface. They're still together, still talking, still functioning. So he tells himself, it's just stress. She's tired. Maybe I'm overthinking. But then something else happens. He has a rough week. Work slows down. He's distracted, less sharp, less on top of things. And for the first time in a long time, he's not fully in control. He's still there, still committed, but he's not performing at the same level. And that's when he notices it. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to feel it. The warmth drops. The attention shifts. The way she looks at him changes. And now, for the first time, he doesn't just feel confused, he feels replaceable. That thought doesn't come in loud. It creeps in quietly, uninvited, uncomfortable. Because it forces a question he's never really asked before, not seriously, not honestly. What if this was never about me, but about what I do? And once that thought enters your mind, it doesn't leave. Daniel tries to ignore it at first, because if he follows that thought too far, he already knows where it leads. So instead, he does what most men do. He leans in. He starts paying more attention again, becomes sharper, more proactive, more useful. He fixes the things he lets slip, handles problems before they even reach her, makes sure everything is running smoothly again. And almost immediately, something interesting happens. She softens. The tension disappears. Her tone changes back. She becomes warmer, more engaged, more present. And for a moment, everything feels normal again, which should feel like relief, but it doesn't. Because now Daniel has seen the pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The connection didn't come back randomly. It came back when he stepped back into function, not when he expressed himself,
not when he slowed down, not when he needed space, only when he performed. That's when it hit him. This isn't about emotional closeness. This is about stability, about output, about what he brings to the table consistently. And the more he observes, the clearer it becomes. Her attraction isn't constant. It fluctuates based on him. Not who he is, but how he shows up, how sharp he is, how useful he is, how in control he seems. And now he starts replaying everything in his head. All those moments he brushed off, the times she pulled away right when he was overwhelmed, the times she became distant when he needed support, the subtle disappointment in her voice when he wasn't at his best. At the time, he thought, I need to do better. Now he's starting to think, wait, why does this only go one way? Because when she had bad days, he adjusted. He stayed steady, supportive, present. But when he did, something changed. And that imbalance is hard to ignore once you feel it. That's when frustration starts to build. Not explosive frustration, not anger, something quieter, heavier, a kind of emotional fatigue. Because now every interaction carries a hidden pressure, not just to be there, but to be on, to be sharp, capable, reliable, all the time.
And if he isn't, he already knows what happens. Not a fight, not a clear rejection, something worse. A slow withdrawal, less warmth, less attention, less presence, until he corrects himself, until he gets back into role. And this is where most men get stuck, because instead of questioning the dynamic, they adapt to it. They optimize. They become better performers, better providers, better problem solvers, stronger, more controlled, more disciplined, not realizing they're reinforcing the exact thing that's draining them. Because the better he performs, the more the relationship depends on it, and the less room there is for him to simply exist. And that leads to a realization most men avoid for as long as they can, because once you say it out loud, you can't go back. What if the relationship doesn't run on love, but on dependency? And what if the dependency isn't emotional, but functional? What Daniel is experiencing isn't random, and it's not just his relationship. It's a pattern, a quiet system that most people are inside of, but very few can clearly see. Because on the surface, everything still looks normal. There's no explicit agreement. No one says it out loud, but the dynamic is there, and it runs on something simple: exchange. Not emotional exchange, functional exchange. He provides stability, she provides presence. He brings structure, she brings warmth. He solves, she responds. And as long as that loop is maintained, the relationship feels intact. But here's where it gets complicated, because this doesn't feel like a transaction. It feels like connection. That's what makes it so hard to detect, because the reward he gets, attention, affection, engagement, arrives right after he performs his role. So his brain links the two. I show up like this, and I get closeness, which slowly conditions him, not to be himself, but to be effective, to be needed. And over time, something subtle happens. His identity shifts. He stops asking, "Am I loved?" and starts asking, "Am I doing enough?" That's the trade. And the system rewards it, but only temporarily. Because this kind of dynamic has a hidden rule. The value isn't who you are, it's how consistently you deliver. And consistency is fragile. Life happens, energy drops, stress builds, things go wrong. And the moment his output fluctuates, the feedback changes. Not always consciously, not always intentionally, but predictably.
because attraction in this dynamic is tied to perception, and perception is tied to performance. That's why she doesn't need to make a decision to pull away. It just happens. The same way his effort automatically increases when he feels distance. They're both responding to the system, not necessarily choosing it. And that's the part most people miss. This isn't about blame, it's about structure. Modern relationships for a lot of men are no longer anchored in unconditional bonding. They're stabilized through perceived value. And perceived value is constantly evaluated. Status, control, direction, competence. If those signals are strong, connection feels easy. If they weaken, everything starts to feel unstable. Not because love suddenly disappeared, but because the system that was holding everything together was never love to begin with. It was alignment of roles, and roles only work as long as they're performed. That's why Daniel feels the shift so sharply, because for the first time, he's not just inside the system, he's seeing it. And once you see the mechanism, you realize something uncomfortable. The relationship didn't change, your awareness did. And that awareness changes everything. Because now Daniel can't go back to the old interpretation. He can't tell himself the same story anymore, that it's just stress, that it's just phases, that he just needs to show up better. Because now he sees the pattern behind the pattern. And once that clicks, a different kind of question starts to form. Not, what did I do wrong? But, what exactly is holding this together? And the answer isn't comfortable. Because what he starts to realize is this: being needed can look almost identical to being loved until the moment you stop being needed. That's where the illusion breaks. Because real love doesn't fluctuate based on performance. It doesn't reward you for being useful and quietly withdraw when you're not. But necessity does. Dependency does. A system built on function does. And that's the distinction most men were never taught to make. Because growing up, he was told, be reliable, be strong, be the one people can count on. And those traits are valuable. They build respect, they create stability, but they also create something else: expectation. And expectation is not the same as appreciation. Expectation doesn't ask, how do you feel? It asks, are you still delivering? That's why the shift feels so confusing, because nothing obvious breaks. There's no clear betrayal, no dramatic moment, just a gradual change in how he's received. A subtle recalibration of how much warmth he gets, based on how much he gives. And when you see that clearly, you start to understand something most men spend years avoiding. You can be deeply integrated into someone's life and still not be genuinely desired. You can be essential and still be replaceable. Because what's valued is not you, it's the role you occupy. And roles, by definition, can always be filled by someone else. That's the part that hits the hardest. Not the distance, not the coldness, but the realization that the connection might not be tied to you as a person, only to what you consistently provide. And once that thought lands, it doesn't create anger, it creates clarity. A quiet, heavy clarity. Because now he understands something that reshapes everything that came before. He wasn't losing her, he was losing the conditions that made him valuable. And that kind of clarity comes with a cost. Because once Daniel sees it, he can't unknow it. Every interaction starts to feel different. Not because she changed overnight, but because now he's aware of what's underneath. The small reactions, the subtle shifts, the timing of her attention. It all starts to make sense. And that's exactly what makes it heavier. Because now he notices the pressure, not external pressure, internal. The constant need to maintain a certain version of himself, not just to grow, but to preserve what he already has. And that creates a kind of tension most men never talk about, because it doesn't look like struggle from the outside. He's still functioning, still providing, still handling everything. But internally, something starts to wear down. It's the feeling that rest has consequences, that slowing down has a price, that being human is a risk. So he compensates. He becomes more controlled, more calculated. He filters what he says. He manages how he shows up. He avoids showing weakness, not out of ego, but out of pattern recognition, because he's seen what happens when he does. And over time, that does something to a man. It disconnects him from himself, because now he's not acting naturally. He's performing strategically, even in moments that are supposed to be real, even in moments that are supposed to be safe. And that creates a quiet kind of loneliness, the kind that exists even when you're not alone, because the connection around you isn't responding to you fully. It's responding to the version of you that works, the version that delivers, the version that holds everything together. And the more consistent he becomes in that role, the less space there is for anything else, for doubt, for fatigue, for vulnerability. Not because those things disappear, but because they're no longer allowed. And that's where the emotional exhaustion really begins. Not from doing too much, but from never being able to stop. Because stopping changes how you're perceived, and perception now controls connection. So instead of feeling secure, he feels managed, measured, evaluated. Not explicitly, not consciously, but consistently. And the hardest part isn't even the effort, it's what that effort replaces. Authenticity, spontaneity, emotional freedom, all traded for stability, for continuity, for a version of connection that only holds as long as he keeps holding everything else. And eventually, a question starts to form, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of quiet fatigue. If I have to keep becoming more just to maintain this, what happens when I don't have anything left to give? And that question doesn't have an easy answer, because deep down, he already knows. That's when things don't break suddenly. That's when they slowly stop working. At this point, most men face a quiet fork in the road, not an obvious one. There's no dramatic moment, no clear decision point, just a shift in how they start interpreting everything. Because once you see the pattern, you have two options. You either keep playing your role more efficiently, or you start questioning the role itself. And that second path is uncomfortable, because it forces you to look at something most men were never encouraged to examine. Not her behavior, not the relationship, but your own positioning inside it. Because the dynamic didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built, reinforced, stabilized over time, partially by her responses, but also by what you consistently chose to prioritize: reliability over expression, control over honesty, stability over authenticity. Not because it was wrong, but because it worked. It kept things smooth, predictable, functional. But now you understand the trade-off. Because when a relationship is built primarily on what you provide, that becomes the language it understands. And anything outside of that becomes harder to recognize, harder to respond to. That's why simply pulling back doesn't solve it. That's why doing less often makes things worse, because the structure itself hasn't changed. Only your output has, and the system reacts accordingly. So the real shift isn't about withdrawing, it's about redefining.
Redefining what you bring, what you tolerate, what you consider connection. Because if usefulness is the foundation, you'll always feel replaceable, no matter how well you perform. But if presence becomes part of the equation, something different starts to happen. Not immediately, not easily, but structurally. Because now you're no longer just reinforcing the role. You're introducing something the dynamic wasn't built to handle. You, without the function. And that creates friction, sometimes distance, sometimes confusion, sometimes resistance. Because now the interaction is no longer predictable. And that's the moment where things reveal themselves more clearly than ever. Not when everything is working, but when it's not. Because that's when you find out what the connection was actually responding to, and more importantly, what it was never built to hold. And this is where most men gain something they didn't have before. Not control, not certainty, clarity. The ability to see the difference between being valued and being needed. And once you truly understand that difference, you stop asking, how do I keep this working? And start asking, what is this actually built on? Most men don't notice this dynamic when it starts. Because in the beginning, being needed feels good. It feels like purpose, like importance, like you matter. And for a while, that's enough. But over time, something shifts, not in the relationship itself, but in how it feels to carry it. Because what once felt like connection starts to feel like responsibility, and what once felt natural starts to feel managed. That's when the question returns, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Is this about me or about what I do? And the answer isn't always clear. Because in many cases, it's both. That's what makes this so difficult to untangle. Because real relationships often contain elements of both love and dependency, care and utility, connection and function. The problem isn't that usefulness exists. It always will. The problem is when it becomes the foundation. Because foundations define what happens under pressure, and pressure is inevitable. Life will test consistency, energy will fluctuate, performance will drop. And when that happens, whatever the relationship is built on becomes visible, not in words, but in reactions, in distance, in tone, in presence. So the real question was never, was she using me? It's simpler than that, and at the same time, much harder to face. What was this actually built on from the start? Because once you answer that honestly, you stop chasing stability at any cost. You stop confusing consistency with connection, and you stop measuring your value only through what you provide. Not because providing is wrong, but because it was never supposed to be the only thing that defines you. And maybe that's the realization most men arrive at just a little later than they wish they had. That being needed might keep something going, but it doesn't guarantee that it was ever real to begin with. And once you see that clearly, you don't just look at the relationship differently. You start looking at yourself differently too. And from that point on, you don't just ask if it works, you ask if it's real. And that question changes everything. If this connected with you, subscribe to the channel, because this is where we break down the patterns most men feel, but don't have the words to explain. And if you've ever experienced this yourself, drop a comment below. Not the version you tell people, the real version. Because the more this gets said out loud, the harder it becomes to ignore.